Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Laura Boycourt. Today, we'll be talking about STEM, nature, language, and illustration in children's literature. And joining us today are Donna Napoli and Feleecheeta Sala, author and illustrator, respectively, of the new children's picture book As Night Falls from Penguin Random House. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And Feleecheeta, I think you're joining us all the way from Rome. So thanks especially for taking the time to do this today.
Not a problem at all.
So I'd love to start with introductions. Donna Jo, I'm familiar with your work. I know you've had a prolific writing career that spanned the decades. I was hoping you could tell viewers and listeners a little bit about your background as a writer, your experience in education, as a linguist, all of it. And ultimately, what led you to writing children's books?
That's a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah, I did not grow up wanting to be a children's author or any kind of author. I grew up in a very poor family. I didn't ever expect to get an education, and various things happened, and I wound up getting a scholarship to college, and it changed my life entirely. And I majored in math, went on to linguistics. I got a job. I was married. I had a child. My life was perfect. And you know that can't last, because I, like you, am not a charmed, I don't need a charmed life. So I got pregnant a second time, and I lost the baby, and it kind of drove me crazy. Many people just go with the flow, and there are lots of times I have gone with the flow in my life, but this was something that just kind of knocked me over. And I started writing private letters to a friend about everything and nothing. And I worked my way through my grief by writing. About a year after I stopped writing, my friend visited and said, and had saved all my letters and said, "Here, you've written a novel."
Wow.
Which is not true. Random letters do not a novel make, especially random raving letters. But I realized in looking at my letters that some of them were powerful. They made me cry, they made me laugh, and I wanted that power. I did not feel like a powerful person. And I missed them. I missed writing. And I then decided to start telling stories and writing them down. And I had more children and more children. I'm very lucky. I have 5 children. But I started writing stories. And I just wrote stories of any kind, and I knew nothing about writing stories for children. I just had children, and I wanted to write stories. It took me 13 years to sell my first story. Wow. So I'm not someone to follow. But in any case, growing up, my family had all kinds of problems, and we never traveled, never did anything. As I said, we were pretty poor, but writing gave me the world. Writing took me everywhere. My first year of college, on break, the students on my hall, the young women on my hall, flew to Switzerland together to go skiing. And I could never afford to do something like that, of course, but I didn't need to, because I had grown up on an alm in Switzerland. I was Heidi. I was every character in every book I'd ever read. The books gave me the world. And I think that when I write for children, what I am trying to do is give them the world. It makes such a difference to the child who cannot have all those experiences.
That's beautifully put. I love that. And Feleecheeta, what about your road to becoming an illustrator? Where did that start?
Well, similarly to Donna, I didn't have a proper training, let's say, to become an illustrator or author of children's books, and I got there through unusual paths, let's say. So I moved to Australia when I was 7 years old with my family. And so I kind of grew up between two countries, because at the beginning we would kind of be back and forth because of my dad's work and studies. And so I ended up studying there. I wanted to study art. I was always drawn to art, but I wasn't satisfied with the courses offered at the time. This was the late 90s, early 2000s. And like in terms of fine art, there was only like conceptual art. I mean, that was the main thing in a country like Australia, which is a very young country. And I wanted, you know, to learn painting and anatomy and like go to a proper art school. And I didn't really know illustration either. So what I did was I went to study philosophy, which is completely different, because there's a line that's written in my university. It says, "Seek wisdom," and this line has always stayed with me. I think I really had a desire to learn and to gain some kind of wisdom and insight into life and I thought that will always serve me for later. It doesn't matter what I do, and it did. And after that, I started traveling around teaching English as a second language in Spain and Italy. And long story short, I ended up moving back to Italy in 2007, where I met my boyfriend, who then became my husband, who was working as a part of a collective of artists and illustrators and animators in an underground kind of bunker in Rome. When I fell in love with it, and I discovered illustration through these people. And I started studying picture books and reading lots of picture books and reconnecting with the picture books I'd read in my childhood. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to make picture books. And so I got to figuring out how I was going to do that. So I started going to the Bologna Book Fair every year. And part of that process was me getting extremely discouraged and wanting to give up and thinking, I think I'll just teach English for the rest of my life, because at least that'll give me some free time, because teaching, it's not like a 40-hour-a-week job. You know, it gives you some spare time. So I thought that'll give me some spare time to paint, because I also like painting, and maybe illustrate on the side. And I was kind of happy with that. I didn't think I was going to make it very far because of the competitive nature of like any kind of creative field. If you want to make it to the top and live with it, you have to be, you know, really persistent and determined. And I'm not really that type of person. I kind of tend to give up very easily. So I just started doing things on the side. And then I think slowly through the years, I started just working, you know, with magazines at first, and then small publishers started to see my work online. You know, it was thanks to the internet. And then my agent found me, Kirsten Hall at Catbird, and then I started working a bit more with American publishers, which allowed me to not worry so much about teaching English anymore. I could actually kind of start living with it and paying the rent with it. Like Donna, I didn't come from an affluent family, so I always desired to do, you know, art courses, but they were always too expensive. I had to work, I had to pay my rent, and so I didn't have time to study any more courses after I did philosophy in Australia, which is government subsidized, unlike America. And so these expensive art courses I never got to do, and I kind of just taught myself how to illustrate just by reading lots of picture books and seeing what was coming out in mainly Europe. I mean, I was just looking at European picture books over the last few years because of where I am and because of the enormous amount of artistic picture books that get produced in France and Italy and Spain and the European countries. And then it was later that I started to get an appreciation also of Anglo-Saxon picture book tradition from, you know, the UK and America, and I started looking into those things, and that actually fed into, so my let's say my artistic tendencies were fed by the European picture book market, but my narrative tendencies were getting food from the English speaking tradition. And so I think that combined in my mind into like what I think, you know, I would like to work in, like what kind of books I would like to make and so on. At that time, I was getting a lot of biographical stories and things like that. But I think now I'm heading towards a slightly different direction. And maybe we'll talk about it in the next few questions. But for example, Donna's text is an example of those kind of weird eclectic mixes of like poetry and eccentric art experimentation and STEM, I suppose. And I like where that's going. I like that I'm getting to change and experiment as I go on. And I feel extremely lucky to be doing this job. I never imagined in my life that I could do this as a job, to live as I suppose as an artist, although I don't like to use that word very lightly, because to me it's like the standards of that are very, very high. But you know, that's sums it up, I suppose, my journey.
No, that's wonderful. So both relatively self-taught and from personal experiences, and now you are where you are, which is fantastic. So I'm going to do things a little bit out of order. I wanted to talk about sort of your favorite subject matter to illustrate and to write, but first, I want to talk about the relationship between an author and an illustrator, which is so interesting because the two of you have never met face to face. I think this is the first sort of, type of meeting. So for this book, for As Night Falls, which we'll talk about in a minute, you obviously had to work together. So I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about what the marriage is like between an author's vision, an illustrator's vision, how you're able to work together, what type of discussions are had. So maybe Donna Jo, we could start with you from your perspective, how this works.
I think that one of the big mistakes that starting writers and starting illustrators make is to think that there is a kind of a marriage that you can decide on yourself and present to a publishing house. If you're a new writer, probably the publishing house does not want you to come with an illustrator, because then they're trying to introduce to the market a new writer and a new illustrator. And you've robbed them of one of their best marketing techniques, which is to put a new writer with a well-known illustrator so the book will sell on the name of the illustrator and they can introduce the writer to the market that way. Or the same thing for a new illustrator, match them with a well-known writer. The other thing is, I don't think it's just a marketing strategy. I think it's smart to take a manuscript, not a writer, but a manuscript, and put the manuscript in front of the illustrator without access to the writer, so that the illustrator is working solely from the words on the page. As a writer, you've got all these things in your head and you think you've spilled them out onto the page, but you haven't. You've only spilled on certain things. That's why reading is such a creative act, because you read into it much more than what is just in those words, and everybody reads it in their own way. The illustrator will read it in her own way and add a world that makes sense to her, that goes with these words, and that enriches it enormously. If you are a writer and illustrator yourself, by all means, try to illustrate your own stories, of course. But if you're not both, allow a really good editor to match you properly. We have a brilliant editor. I think Lee Wade at Penguin Random was just brilliant in throwing us together. I'm so delighted.
Well, the book is beautiful, beautifully written, beautifully illustrated. Feleecheeta, what about from your perspective? What is the relationship like? Sort of what's the responsibility, I guess, as the illustrator? What do you bring to the table? What do you draw from the words?
Well, for me, I mean, first and foremost, it's to kind of do justice to the text and to honor the text in the best way that I can. And yeah, I mean, usually, at least when the United States is concerned, I receive texts from authors that I sometimes have heard of, sometimes I haven't. And I work with them, and usually I make contact with the author later on down the track. Maybe the author contacts me to say, I love how you going, how you doing with this? Or right at the end, when the book has kind of almost come out, we can make contact. And then we also sometimes meet in person, because often the authors are traveling through Italy, never the other way around, unfortunately. But so I've had the pleasure of meeting, actually in Bologna, I met a couple of the authors that I've worked with, and I've met others in the past. Also, I've happened to work with, I have a close friend who is an author here in Italy. She's a very renowned author in Italy, and we've worked on books together where we've pitched the project together, but that rarely happens. Usually it's how Donna describes it. And it's interesting, yes, because you're just looking at the text and you don't know who wrote it, in a sense. You don't know why it was written. And this particular text that Donna and I worked on was quite a struggle for me. And I had to ask Donna for help. And I don't usually do that, because I don't want to feel like they need I don't want to create a kind of struggle. Although I have communicated before in the past before to comment on something about the text, to ask to clarify, things like that. But usually, to put simply, I don't comment on the text, and the author doesn't comment on the illustration, in the sense that we don't tell each other what to do or what to change, although that can happen. And I know that there are authors and illustrators that feed into each other, and they comment on each other's work. But for this one, I asked Donna for help, because I really was curious about what brought her to write this text. Because when I received it the first time, it was read to me over the phone by my agent. And I remember there's something about reading manuscripts or stories. There's a different, it's different to just reading them on a page. And I remember listening to it and thinking, this is beautiful. And I thought, yes, I want to do it. I didn't think too much about who wrote it, who's it for. I just remember liking it. And I remember thinking, I'm going to do I think I'm going to get to do something quite wild with this one. And I was excited about it. And then, of course, then it was months later before I actually sat down and started thinking about the storyboard, which is the beginning phase. So I have to sketch ideas, very small black and white sketches for each page. And suddenly I was confronted with this enormous void. I just had no idea where I was going to go with it. I thought, okay, there's something, yes, sciencey about this, but there's also something that caused me to be more wild and experimental, but I just didn't know. And I wrote to Donna about it, and she graciously answered all these thoughts that she had when she wrote it. And that maybe we can talk about as well, but about the curiosity of children, and this kind of wild side that children and animals have that they share. And then also the famous poem, Tiger, Tiger, that was kind of symbolic of that image of the tiger. That and that really helped me a lot to think about how I was going to go about it. But I mean, it helped me in terms of an instinct that I can't quite describe. It wasn't like she said, I think you should do this, So that was a really interesting process for me to talk about it with Donna, even if just in terms of what inspired her to write it and so on, to connect with her.
Thank you for the insight, because as a consumer and an avid reader and mom of two girls who just devour picture books and chapter books, it's really neat to hear sort of the inner workings of the relationship. So let's end the suspense. As night falls, it's sort of a glimpse into what creatures do after dark, and from, was it algae to spiders to jackals, it sort of covers the range. And as you were saying, it sort of links the wild side of children, who we know can be very wild, and these animals. So I guess my first question is for Donna Jo. I guess why did you want to write about this? What was your inspiration? Where'd that come from?
One of the things that concerns me is that so many people talk about naughty children. And I think that a child can get the idea that they are naughty. You lie down in bed, and some children just close their eyes, but other children just jump right back up. And things invade your mind as you're finding that transition into a different state of consciousness. And you're not naughty because of it. You're in need, and maybe somebody needs to give you an extra kiss or an extra romp around the room or whatever. So I just wanted to address that, but I wanted to address it in a way that makes you feel like you're part of everything, because we are part of everything. And I love the idea of, you have this itty bitty bacterium, and along comes the first one was a dinoflagellate. I loved the word dinoflagellate.
Yeah.
I wanted to give that word to the children. And this little dinoflagellate comes along and eats it. And then you've got the dinoflagellate going on a little bit bigger, and along comes the copepod and eats it. And each time there's something a little bit bigger getting eaten by something else that's bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can feel like that as a child, that something's just growing inside you so large, it's got to go somewhere. And where does it go? Well, it's a tiger inside you. But it's not a scary tiger. It's part of us. We are carnal, which doesn't mean that you have to be a carnivore, but it means that you do have to recognize that this thing of the food chain is a natural, normal thing around you. And there's so many different things that are like the food chain that you deal with every day as a child, as an adult. And you have to learn how to respect them, how to have some understanding for them, which is part of respecting them, and how to control them within yourself, which ones to are you allowed to give into, and in what ways, and which ones is it really important for you to give into. I don't know, I was talking very abstractly, but I think that's how I felt about it, very abstract.
Sure. And just to follow up, it sounds like you could address those feelings, those tendencies in children in a lot of different ways. Do you think it's important to introduce to kids sort of that STEM, that nature, that scientific language and sort of experience in children's literature?
Absolutely. And this is a whole different question. It's sort of, why did I do this if I'm approaching naughtiness? And I think that, when you get to like around maybe 4th grade, 5th grade, you're going to have a lot more science taught in school. And often the people that are teaching you science did not major in science in college, and they might consider science difficult in some way or another. They might at a subconscious level deliver the message that science is hard and difficult, and maybe you don't want to go into science, which is a terrible pity, because if you're little teeny tiny, looking around you at the world is wonderful, and you've got all kinds of information coming at you, some of which is constructed by the human world, but a lot of it is just part of the natural world. And you can recognize that some trees have leaves that are all the same shape but different sizes, and some leaves some trees have leaves that have different shapes, like one thumb or 2 divisions or none. And it's interesting. And if you don't squelch it, anybody is a natural scientist, I think. And we need scientists. I have a lot of faith in humanistic scientists helping to solve the world's problems.
Well said. And Feleecheeta, your illustrations are beautiful, and that's not just lip service. Something in it reminded me of, I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but A Painted Tale by Kate Canning, way back. It was, I think, 1979. It was my most prized possession, a book that my grandmother gave me, but sort of this wild jungle, it was very reminiscent of your illustrations. So when you got the text from Donna Joe, and you're reading about the scientific nature of it, the wild nature, I guess, what were your first inclinations for how you were going to illustrate it? What was that like?
So what I tend to do always at the beginning of any book that I do is to do some research, regardless of whether it's scientific or completely fictional, or if it's about a real life person. I tend to look at, what do I have to draw and how do I go about drawing it? So of course, the first thing I had was a sketchbook where I drew all the animals from the dinoflagellates onwards. And I researched how they were made and what they looked like. And I mean, to me, being able to draw well, it's not enough to be able to draw well. I mean, drawing well for me is a basis on which to build and to abstract. So I needed to find the right level of abstraction for these creatures so that they would be as playful and poetic in picture form as the text was, because the text is not a didactical, rigid structure that teaches you about dinoflagellates. It's a moving, breathing thing, and you can see, but just by reading it, that it has this breathing movement. That it starts off with the calm, and then it goes up and down, and then it gets eaten, and then there's this explosion with the tiger, and then you take another breath, and you calm down, and I wanted to kind of show that in a way. So at the beginning, I did all these drawings, and then I got to a kind of block point. I didn't know where to go. There was a big crisis for me where I genuinely, I think I actually cried over this book. But it's about, I cry over a lot. Like when I cry over books, it means that there's a struggle going on, and usually I usually come out victorious on the other end. Not always, but for this one, I think I did, because what happened was that I started to experiment with color. And I think there was one point at which I thought, I'm just going to have fun with it, because I feel like Donna had fun with it. And I want to have fun with it too. So when I decided that I was going to have fun with it and just play and not worry about what I was going to do, just play, and I started experimenting. And the idea, there was this book, The Art Forms in Nature by Ernest Haeckel, I have it here, that I looked at, which explores I don't know if you can see it. It's a famous botanical illustrator that looks, he starts at looking at fossils and all kinds of microcosms and underwater creatures. And I thought about this, the luminous forms in the underground or underwater. So these kind of bright colors and then the darkness. And it was a poem about nighttime. So I think that inspired me a lot into using this kind of dark black, blue hues, and then starting to have pops of colors come in. So the beginning of the book starts out just blue and black, and then there's a light that comes on, a little window comes on because there's a child who's still awake. And then from there we start having, on top of the yellow, we start seeing little bubbles emerge in the river of color. And then there's a kind of mounting of color going up towards the tiger, which is like the explosion, and then it goes back down to the blue hue. So I used color as a technique to also follow this rhythm of the story. And it was when I started having fun with it, then I think the book started coming together, that I found the freedom to illustrate it in the right way.
Fantastic. Well, as just a 40-something who has read it, it was really engaging to me, and so I can see how it would be so for young children. And speaking of sort of the engagement with children's books, so many of them, not a blanket statement, but a lot of them can sort of, I don't want to say dumb down language, but just, oversimplify things. And for some audiences, you need to have, very simplistic language and illustrations and things like that. But Donna, Joe, this one with the dinoflagellates, goby fish, spotted belly eagled owls, these aren't simplified. These are, they're scientific real names. Just your background as a linguist, and I think I might get this wrong, but your words to make a friend, a story in Japanese and English, as well as Hands and Hearts with 15 words in American Sign Language, your sort of love for language, and then Feleecheeta, you as well with your ESL background. I guess my question is, why is it important to sort of give children the real scientific words, to expose them to the accurate? That's something that I appreciated in this. You know, even though it might sort of at a glance be a little bit above their level in some ways, I think it's really important as a parent and as a consumer of literature to expose kids to sort of the real names. Any thoughts on that, Donna Jo?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts
That
on
was a
it.
huge question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it's a beautiful question. Many times people think that when you're talking to children, you have to dumb down your language. You don't have to dumb down your language. There are many cultures in which people talk to children the same way they talk to adults. That's just how they do it. So what's called motherese is culture specific, and people think it helps children learn to speak, but there's no evidence that it helps the ordinary child learn to speak. Children just absorb language. And the thing about absorbing language is that it's power. If you know how to say what you want to say, if you've got the right words to get across those ideas, it gives you a huge amount of power. I remember when my first child, when she was 2 years old, at a certain point when she was doing something that maybe wasn't the most desirable thing for her to be doing at that moment, and I'd be telling her why she shouldn't do it. At a certain point, she'd say, "You can't talk." And it was saying, stop with the big power that you have all these words. I don't have all these words to respond to you. It's unfair. Stop. And it taught me a lot. I think my first child taught me a lot about how to parent in a sensible way. But yeah, give children words. No words are too hard for them. The concepts behind the words might be hard for them, but the concept behind dinoflagellate is just this little creature. It's not a difficult concept. You know, something like incandescent or ephemeral. Maybe those words are a little bit hard for a child, but not to learn, but to understand. Dinoflagellate's not hard to understand.
No, I get that. And Feleecheeta, I don't know, your illustrations, they're very truthful. You know, they're not cartoons. They're not, you know, like something that's going to be on Nickelodeon. They're truthful. You know, they look like what these creatures and animals are supposed to look like. So I guess same question to you. You know, not to say that your technique and sort of the way you illustrate can't vary from project to project, but for this one, for As Night Falls in particular, I guess what kind of truth, or what for you as an illustrator, what's the value in bringing that truth to a story?
In terms of visual truth, visual representation, I think it depends on the project. I think like I've worked on projects where I had to present real people, and of course I couldn't make them up. They had to be those people. They had to be recognizable. Like Pablo Neruda looked like Pablo Neruda, so I had to study his face. But then there's always a level of abstraction and that's where style comes in. So you bring that person towards your own style, and every illustrator does that in their own unique way. There are some who do very kind of photorealistic illustrations. I tend towards a bit more the abstraction and the folklore. I think that defines a bit more my style of illustrating. So I like to, you know, the tiger has blues and purples and reds running through it, which is not realistic. And the forms are kind of morphing in a way that is not realistic. But that's okay. It's still a recognizable tiger. It's not a complete abstraction. And I think for this book, it needs to be recognizable because we're talking about a specific animal. It's important that we see that animal in relation to the other animal and so on and so forth. But I like to think I played a bit more than I usually do with this one in terms of color and abstraction, and I quite enjoyed it. But it's still, I wouldn't say it's the most important thing to me to render something real and recognizable. I think it depends. It has to be obviously understandable and intelligible to the child. I mean, otherwise, what are we doing? It's just a personal museum of art. I mean, I could make a book of art for a child, and that's fine, where a child would is looking at abstract forms, and that has its own value. But if I'm illustrating a story, there's always an importance of the text image relation that has to shine through. And it has to be that, I mean, for me, it's more about how possibly the child is going to be captured and fascinated by the book as a whole. So the text and image relation, and maybe it's the sound of the word, maybe it's the unconscious flowing of the rhythm of the poem, and maybe it's just the brightness of the colors. Like every child is fixated with particular things, but ultimately I want to contribute to that fascination of the child. For me, that's the foremost, most important thing in what I do, is contributing to that dream world that they have, that they live in. That is so important.
Sure. And as we wrap things up, one more loaded question for both of you. Just throughout your journeys as an author and illustrator, what are some of the most rewarding things for you? And again, I know that can go lots of different directions, but just in what you've experienced so far, what's been the most rewarding? Donna, Joe, what about you?
I'm going to sound so corny,
That's
but
okay.
I love it when children write to me. I have a website and they can just contact me, and I love it. Writing is a very lonely business. You're just there with your computer. I used to be there with a pencil and paper, and you've got your editor, but you've got your family, you've got your friends, but how much can you impose on everyone else? And you don't really know what it's like. It's like you're throwing your work out into the void. And so there's a person out there that caught it and writes to you, and it's wonderful. I want to be the book that is under a child's pillow that they reach for when they need it. I really want to be that worn out book.
I love that. Feleecheeta, what about you?
Absolutely. I totally identify with what you said, Donna. I think there was a point where in lockdown, there was a book that I only wrote 2 books, and they were kind of recipe picture books, and there was a lot of families actually using them in lockdown to cook with their children. And because these books have recipes, and alongside them they have the person in the kitchen cooking. So every page there's a person or a family or whatever, and then there's a recipe that they're cooking. I think children were fascinated by this, like looking inside the person's kitchen and then looking at the foods on the white space. And I got probably the most feedback I ever gotten was over that particular book. And I would be getting messages and videos, mostly during the time of the pandemic, because that's kind of when it came out, and of children using that book and cooking it, but also sometimes taking the book to bed with them. And it's never happened to me before. And that truly is the peak for, I think, for anyone working in this industry, is the peak of your of what you do is when you get that kind of response. It just makes you so happy. I mean, it just beats anything else. Awards, positive feedback from other illustrators, or like I mean, to me, when the children respond, it means I'm doing the right thing somehow.
Well, it sounds like it's a similar situation for both of you. And as someone on the outside, thank you for what you're bringing to all these children's lives, and using your talents to make a positive impact. So thank you so much to author Donna Jo Napoli and illustrator Feleecheeta Sala for taking the time to chat with us about their new book, As Night Falls, as well as the writing and illustrating process, STEM and nature and beautiful language in children's literature. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners as well. Make sure you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. I'm Laura Boycourt with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thanks so much.